Old dogs can learn new tricks. Okay, so today we're going to continue talking about cognitive illusions. We began talking about this in Monday's lecture in the context of decision making. And we started talking about the topic of decision making by starting with a discussion of first talking about kind of the errors, what goes wrong, what can go wrong in our decision making. And then eventually we will move on to talking about models and theories about generally how we do decision making well. But again, here we're taking the kind of an approach that in order to help us understand what normal functioning looks like, we need to have an idea of kind of where the breakdowns in functioning can occur. So we're going to continue talking about various cognitive illusions. And these are, if you'll remember back to Monday's lecture, these are essentially the sort of tendencies that we have to jump to conclusions and to try to take mental shortcuts, which the shortcuts in and of themselves are not necessarily bad, but sometimes we don't apply them in the best circumstances, and it leads us down a road where we're more likely to make mistakes when we're trying to make good decisions. So one of the next cognitive illusions that we're going to talk about is what's called the representativeness heuristic. So let's imagine that there are two students, Lisa and Joe, who are really bored one Saturday. I would love to be bored on a Saturday. That sounds great. Maybe once the semester's over, fingers crossed. But for lack of something better to do, they just start flipping a coin and they keep track of the way that it lands over time. And then they compare their different results. So Lisa reports that her sequence of coin flips results in the following pattern that you see on the slide. So heads, 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 tails, tails, tails. And Joe gets tails, tails, heads, tails, heads, heads. And so now the question is, well, which student has obtained a more statistically probable series of results? Does anyone want to take a guess? You're all like, no, like you just said that these are cognitive illusions. So I don't want to say something and potentially be wrong. Noah, were you going to jump in with something though?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, aren't they statistically the same since they're not? The coin flip isn't dependent on the previous coin. The next coin flip isn't dependent on the previous coin flip.
Yeah, exactly. So for those of us in the psychology field who have a lot more experience with statistics, if you sit and really think about it in sort of a statistics framework, eventually you'll hopefully get where Noah is at, where these are actually representative of the exact same probability. But if you were just to go with your intuition, which is what a lot of people tend to go with when they're first trying to make a decision in this kind of scenario, most people will say that just based on their intuition of like, well, like it looks like Joe's sequence of flipping seems like it's more statistically probable. And so this is because the sequence of responses that Joe got is there's less of a pattern to it. There's less predictability to it, and it's more random looking. But in fact, like Noah pointed out, the outcomes are actually equally likely. Across 6 of these trials, both Lisa and Joe got 50% of the trials with heads and 50% of the trials with tails. And this is the probability that we would expect over time. And so The problem is that people will generally come to expect a random process, such as coin flipping, to always produce results that look random. And so this means that they expect the results to be representative of the process that is used to generate them. In this case, they're expecting, well, if there's this randomness that's functioning to generate these results, then the results should represent that random operation. And so people who are making judgments based in this sort of way are using this heuristic, this mental shortcut of representativeness. So there's a study done in 1973 by Kahneman and Tversky, and you'll see that this pair of researchers will keep coming up. They're pretty foundational in the field of decision making within cognitive psychology, and they've contributed a lot. So they're pretty popular names, and we'll keep encountering them. But they demonstrated people's uses of the representativeness heuristic in a series of studies. And so in one of these studies, they used undergrad students and they assigned them to one of three conditions. So they could be in the base rate condition, the similarity condition, or the prediction condition. And so for those in the base rate condition, they were asked to consider all of the first-year graduate students who are in the United States today, and then come up with your best guesses about the percentage of grad students who are enrolled in each of the following 9 fields. And so you can see the different fields of grad school that were provided to participants here on the slide. So for each one, they're just supposed to come up with, like, take your best guess about how many graduate students in total are in business admin, are in computer science, etc. Those participants who were in the similarity condition, they experienced something different. So they were presented with a personality sketch, similar to this one that I'm showing you here on the slide. It says, Tom W. is of high intelligence, although lacking in true creativity. He has a need for order and clarity and for neat and tidy systems in which every detail finds its appropriate place. His writing is rather boring and mechanical, occasionally enlivened by somewhat cheesy puns and by flashes of imagination of the sci-fi type. He has a strong drive for competence. He seems to have little feeling and little sympathy for other people and doesn't enjoy interacting with others. Although he's self-centered, he nonetheless has a deep moral sense. And so participants in this condition, after they read this description or these kinds of descriptions about hypothetical people, they were asked to then rank the 9 fields of graduate programs in terms of how similar they thought this Tom W. individual was, how similarly did he sort of seem to be of the graduate students who go into those particular fields. And then lastly, the prediction condition, they were also given a description, a personality description, but they were told that this was from a few years ago when Tom was in high school. And then they were asked to predict the likelihood for each field that they thought would be the case for Tom being in that field. So a little bit complex, but essentially what they found was essentially that these participants were demonstrating the use of the representativeness heuristic. So the participants who were in the similarity and the prediction conditions, that is the ones who were engaging with this description of a certain person, they were comparing this description that they got to their beliefs about what sort of typical or representative graduate students are like in a given field. And so they weren't basing this information off of more objective information, such as the base rates, right? We know that it's not like there's an even spread of graduate students across all 9 of those different academic disciplines, right? There's likely going to be more students in certain fields in comparison to others, say library science. It's probably drawing less graduate students in comparison to other ones, such as medicine, for example. So instead of basing it on more objective information, what these participants were doing then is they were basing it on their beliefs and their ideas about what typical people are like in each of those sorts of fields. So, and it's important to take into consideration information like base rates, because the failure to include this kind of information into your estimates of probability, they can lead you to errors that are pretty large at times. So again, if you're assuming, oh, well, you know, someone's equally likely to be in any of these fields, you just say, well, I mean, Tom kind of sounds like closed off, maybe not so much of like a people person, then that's going to skew the way that you go about thinking about that problem. And so there's a related error in judgment that's called the gambler's fallacy. So imagine yourself, you know, in Vegas, post-COVID, and you're beside a roulette wheel. And for those of you who might not be familiar, roulette wheels, they're wheels like they sound, and they have red and black alternating compartments on them. And so there's like a ball or a marker that moves when you spin the wheel, and you're betting on what color you think that the ball or the marker is going to land on. Is it going to land on red or is it going to land on black? So in this, let's say that you've been playing roulette and the wheel has come up on red 8 times in a row. Assuming that you're still willing to believe that the wheel is equally likely to come up black as it is red, right? Assuming that, hey, this isn't a rigged roulette wheel, where would you place a bet for the next spin? Most people are going to bet on black. And this is because they're drawing on the reasoning that if black and red are equally likely, then the previous outcomes of these 8 reds in a row, those kind of have skewed the results. So now it must be black's turn. However, on the next trial though, the chances of black are exactly the same as the chances of red. So it's not like this wheel is keeping track of the past results and has realized, ooh, you know what? I've given red a lot of opportunities. Now I'm going to switch it up and it's going to be black's turn. But although in the long run, the number of times that black has come up should equal the number of times that red has come up, this doesn't mean that in the short term, you're going to see these proportions. And so this explanation also applies to the coin flipping example that I talked about earlier. So random processes such as flipping a coin or spinning a roulette wheel, they're not always going to produce random results, rather, that look random, especially in the short term. So it's important to keep this in mind. You know, whether or not you go to Vegas, that probability is, it's going to sort of reset every single time you participate in something, whether that's, you know, buying a lotto ticket or gambling on a roulette wheel. And somewhat kind of related that sort of plays into this gambler's fallacy is what Tversky and Kahneman called people's belief, a mistaken belief, in the law of small numbers. So the idea here is that people expect small samples, whether it's of people, of coin flips, of trials and experiments, of roulette wheel spins, to resemble in every respect the populations from which they're drawn. And so in actuality, really small samples are actually much more likely to deviate from the actual population that they're drawn from, and therefore are less reliable for us to build conclusions off of. And so the gambler's fallacy problem can be thought of as an instance of belief in the law of small numbers. So people expect that a small sample size of roulette wheel spins, such as 8, will show the same proportion of reds as will a very large sample. So if you spun that roulette wheel 10,000 times or 100,000 times. However, the chances of finding really large deviations from the population, like I said, are more likely with a small sample. And so this is why in psychology, we want a larger sample size. You know, even statistics aside, even just thinking about how well things are represented, the more pieces you have to represent that population, the better an understanding of the entirety of that population you can get. And so again, if we're using this representativeness heuristic, thinking, oh, well, this, you know, set of coin flips or this set of roulette spins or this small set of people, they must represent the larger whole from which they're coming from, then you're likely to be making some cognitive errors in the future if you're depending on that. And then finally, what are called man-who arguments are another example of the representativeness heuristic kind of going wrong. And this was a term that was coined by Nisbet and Ross in 1980. And essentially, it's an argument that is given or provided by someone who has just been confronted with a summary of a number of cases of something. So, for example, if you're talking with someone who has been a lifelong smoker, and you're talking about, you know, the statistics that show the kinds of risks that lifelong smoking bring, and they might reply something along the lines of, well, I know a man who, or a person who, smoked 3 packs a day and they live to be 110. This is a particularly vivid example of ignoring base rate information, that is, ignoring the rule and focusing on the exception and thinking that the exception to the rule is actually representative of something in reality. And so thinking, oh, well, you know, my cousin's great uncle's best friend, you know, he smoked 2 packs a day since he was 14 and he lived to the age of 104 and he was incredibly healthy, rather than looking at the rest of the information that's actually a better representation of that population of smokers, for example. So now we're going to move on to another cognitive illusion. So imagine that you're driving down the road, you're running low on gas, right? Your gas light has just come on, and you see that, oh, thank goodness, there are 2 gas stations that are coming up down the road. So station A's price is $3.50 a gallon, and station B's cost is $3.45 a gallon. And you see that there's a sign in front of station A that says, hey, there's a 5 cent per gallon discount that we give if you use cash. And then you also see a sign in front of station B, and this one says there is a 5 cent per gallon surcharge for using credit cards. So all other factors, being equal, like for example, the cleanliness and the appearance of this station, both of them look nice. Both of them are brands of gas that you like. Both of them have lots of open spots. Which station would you then want to go to? Which of these stations would you choose? Would you go station A or station B?
So it wouldn't matter either way, and not even depending on what, like if you're paying with cash or card, because for cash, they'd end up both being $3.45. If you're paying with card, then they're both $3.50. So it's the exact same.
Yes, exactly. Wow, you all are like a very logical bunch of people. Congratulations. Yes, Taylor is correct. It actually wouldn't matter which one you choose because you're going to be paying the same price regardless. So let's talk through this. Why is this the case? And also, interestingly enough, this sort of problem has been posed to other people in studies, and a lot of people would say, oh, well, I would go for gas station A, even though, as Taylor pointed out, the costs are exactly the same, regardless of the station. And so it's really interesting that people have this preference. And Tversky and Kahneman, they explain this phenomenon of, in terms of what are called framing effects. And so this is that people are evaluating outcomes in terms of changes from some sort of reference point. And so they're looking at it within the overarching context of where they're sort of presently at as they're trying to solve that problem. And so depending on how the current state or the current problem is described and understood by them, they perceive certain outcomes as either gains or losses. And so the description, the way in which information is presented, then comes to frame the decision, or like I said, it provides a context for it. And so framing effects, in essence, can be thought of as just contextual effects on our decision making. And the reason for this is the following. We're going to talk through it. So if you see this description as a cash discount, the price seems like a bargain of some sort, right? You assume, oh, I'm starting from a reference point of $3.50, and then I'm going to save or sort of hang on to a nickel per gallon. Great. But in the case of station B, however, you might describe the situation to yourself as follows. Well, you might be like, okay, so all right, well, they're charging $3.45, which great, that's 5 cents less than station A. But if I want to use my card, then they're going to just jack the price up. Like I'm going to be charged more money. I'm going to lose a nickel a gallon that way. I'll just actually go to station A. And Kahneman and Tversky argued that we treat losses more seriously than we do gains when we're trying to come up with a decision, even in situations where what we're going to be spending or doing is exactly the same. So that is, we care more about losing a dollar than we do about gaining a dollar, or losing a nickel versus gaining a nickel. And so the problem is that simply changing the description of a situation can lead us to adopt different reference points for our decision making. And this is something that often happens in marketing. We're not going to go into sort of the applied side of psychology and business, but I'm sure many of you have experienced this sort of framing effect on you, telling you, oh, there's a discount, or there's some sort of sale, or there's an extra charge for using a certain type of payment or things like that. And this has a lot of potential to really sway our decisions because of the context within which we think we're making that decision. So another cognitive illusion is called anchoring. So suppose that I ask you to answer a numerical question by giving me an estimate. So, and the question is, what is the population of Philadelphia as of 2019? I'll give you the correct answer in a moment. So imagine that I'm going to have two imaginary people, Tim and Kim, try to answer this question, but I give them each a starting value to kind of try to help them out. But this is a random value. This is just something I choose at random. Let's say I spin a wheel and Kim and Tim know that I've chosen this at random. So I spin the wheel and I say, okay, Kim, your starting value for trying to come up with this estimate is $1 million. And Tim, your starting value is $2 million. And so if they are like most research participants in a study that was carried out by Tversky and Kahneman in 1973, Kim will guess 1.25 million people, and Tim will guess 1.75. And Kim and Tim are stand-ins for some of the participants from the study who were given these exact starting values and did then give these estimates about Philadelphia's population. And so, in other words, the anchoring effect here is their initial starting point that then influences their final estimates. So the answer is actually almost 1.6 million. But here we can see that the guesses that people make can be shaped on the first information that they have about something that they act on. So an example of this too that often comes up in sort of consumer psychology and figuring out how to sell things to people is the price point at which something is sold to you at. So if you're told that a mug is $300, your anchor point is, whoa, $300 for a mug? Like that mug better like clean my house, do my taxes, like make me the best cup of coffee I've ever had every single day, right? Whereas if you are told that a mug or some other sort of item, you know, oh, it usually sells for this much, but now it's on sale for a lower price. You now have this anchoring point of, oh, this like crazy super futuristic mug, well, it used to be $1,000. Like that is the point at which you're anchored is like, whoa, the value of this is at $1,000, but I can actually get it for $300. So really you're telling me I'm saving $700 when in actuality, the mug was always going to be $300. And so again, this is this influence based on our perspective that comes to have a role in our decision-making processes. So similarly, consider two groups of, I got ahead of myself. So consider two groups of high school students who were given 5 seconds to estimate a complex multiplication problem. So group one is given this. They're given 5 seconds, and let's say on average, across the people in the group, generally their answer that they come to is around 2,250. Now, group two gets this problem given to them. and their average is around 512. And as you can tell, if you sit with it for a moment, maybe you have more than 5 seconds to think about it, you're not under the pressure of the clock, you can tell that both of these problems are identical. So you probably aren't able to tell this right now in the moment, unless you're one of those people who are really good at mental math, in which case I am jealous of you, because I am not. But actually, both of these estimates that these groups have given are way too small, because the correct answer is 40,320. So Tversky and Kahneman also came up with anchoring as the seeming explanation for this sort of issues in calculations as well. And so they explained that people tend to perform the first few steps of a numerically based problem, and then they extrapolate. So they would start with, okay, I've got 5 seconds, and they start looking 8 times 7, okay, 8 times 7, sometimes 6. And then they extrapolate from there. They try to build upon what they've already processed. This extrapolation, it tends to be too little rather than too much. So people, most of the time, when they're taking this sort of extrapolation shortcut, they're often underestimating rather than overestimating something. And so in addition, the people who started with 1 times 2 times 3, that is group 2, they began with a smaller value and came up with a smaller value in comparison to group 1. So we see not only this anchoring effect, right, of, well, depending on the size of the information that you were kind of first given, that's anchoring you. And then in this anchoring process, as you go along trying to process this information, you are going to try to take shortcuts. You're going to extrapolate because you don't have the time and or the mental capacity, right? Like, this is having to calculate large sums in your mind. And that, so you're doing this extrapolation of like, well, okay, I'm just going to sort of generalize or assume. And so, again, we see that anchoring can really have a profound influence on the kinds of estimates that we make when we're faced with more complex information, or maybe in problems where we don't have all the necessary tools that we would like to use in order to figure out the answer on the spot, that we will have this tendency to try to anchor ourselves to a certain point. So another cognitive illusion that we're going to talk about is what are called sunk cost effects. So I'm just going to continue talking about a lot of hypothetical sort of situations here. So let's pretend, oh, that's too early. So let's pretend that there's a major educational initiative that's taking place in your hometown. And the city hall has fundraised or come up with the funds for $3 million that are being invested in this program that's dedicated to help college students stay away from tobacco, alcohol, and drugs. And in the 3rd year of this 4-year program, the evidence really starts to come in. The data is really showing that this program isn't working. It's not making a difference in the amount of substance use rates and other related consequences, hospitalizations, things like that. And so then a local politician proposes, you know what, we just need to cut the funding. We need to end this program before the scheduled date. I know that we have a year left, but it's not working. We're 3 years in and it's not working. And this generates some protest and pushback from local citizens who claim that to stop a program like this after such a large investment and expenditure of resources and monetary funds, well, that would just simply be a waste. And these citizens who are protesting this, they are falling prey to what researchers, Arks and Bloomer, have called the sunk cost effect. And so this is the tendency to continue in an endeavor once an investment in money or effort or time, your emotional resources has been made. So the question is, well, why is this an error? And the explanation goes something like this. The money that has been spent is already gone. Whether or not a great deal of money or time, energy, emotion, etc., has been spent, it doesn't actually affect the future likelihood of successes down the road. So the resources that have been used are used, and regardless of which option is chosen. So regardless of if you keep that program going for another year or you stop it, the money that you already invested in those first 3 years is already spent. And so all of that should then affect your decision and your way of seeing things. This understanding of, well, that money or that time is already gone. I should go ahead and just stop now, sort of stop myself from sort of cut my losses, so to speak. But we can often fall into the error of seeing, well, I've already invested so much. I mean, kind of feel like why would I stop now? A personal example of this that came to mind when I was reading about sunk costs and thinking about it is playing Pokemon Go. I started playing Pokemon Go like the day that it came out. And yeah, it's been a while to continue playing this game of trying to catch digital creatures. And at this point, I've just been like, why am I still playing this game? Even before COVID, I was just like, why am I still playing this game? Like, what is kind of the point? Like, I feel like I've just sort of plateaued. And as I was reading about the sunk cost effects, I was like, oh my gosh, I've continued playing this game because of sunk costs. Yes, exactly, Will. I was like, I do have to catch them all. And then they just keep introducing more and more Pokemon. And I'm like, this is a lot. But anyway, the point is, I continue playing this because I'm like, well, I've already invested so much. I've already gotten this far, right? Like I'm kind of, I'm already so far in it. I might as well keep going, right? Which is an exact example of sunk cost. I'm already like, I've already spent so much time. I've already thrown so many Pokeballs and walked so many steps. I just might as well keep going at this point. So, you know, and even though I'm aware of the sunk cost now, will I still continue to play this game? Yes, I probably will. Okay, so now we are going to move on to the next cognitive illusion that we're going to talk about. So again, let's start with another hypothetical example. So let's say that you and a friend, both of you are psych majors, and you start noticing that students around campus, some of them are displaying a certain sort of behavioral pattern that you and your friends start to call hair twisting. So you're noticing that a person, you know, sort of pinches a strand of hair between their thumb and their fourth finger, and they kind of twist it around. And you believe that this behavior is especially likely in people who are undergoing a great deal of stress. And coincidentally enough, you're like, oh, you know what? I do need a research paper for one of my psych classes. So let's go ahead and use this opportunity. And so you and your friends sort of begin this informal sort of observational study. And you decide, okay, we are going to spend a whole day and we're going to observe people in, the Dees or walking around on campus or, wherever they might be. And we're going to categorize them as either hair twisters or non-hair twisters. And let's say that you come up with a random sample of 150. Like, wow, what a great sample size for the Westmont population, right? And then later, somehow, you're able to track those people down. You have them fill out a questionnaire asking about their current stress levels. And so I'm going to put some hypothetical results of this pretend study up on the slide. So given this data, once you've put it in Excel, you and your friend have tabulated it all, put it in Excel, what is your intuitive estimate of the relationship that exists between stress and hair twisting? Before you start, before you run it in SPSS, what are you kind of thinking the results are going to be? What's this relationship that might exist? All right, well, this was a hypothetical situation that was posed to a class of cognitive psych students, such as yourself. And the majority of them believed that there was at least a weak relationship that existed between the variables of stress levels and hair twisting. But in fact, there's actually no relationship here at all. So if we look at the proportion of people who twist their hair, if we look at the proportion of hair twisters and non-hair twisters based on their different stress levels, the proportion is actually the same. So it's actually, if you have people who are under stress and 20 of them are twisting their hair and 80 of them aren't, that's a proportion of 0.25. And that's the exact same proportion in the not stressed condition. And so, so even though if you take a moment and sort of mathematically break this down, again, if you're just sort of using your intuition, you're not like, okay, well, let me load this into SPSS. Most people sort of tend to report that they see an association in the data that seems plausible, right? It's not like, oh, this is kind of coming out of nowhere. Like, how could you ever think that there might be a relationship between these two things? But this idea of illusory correlation is that people report seeing connections between data that seem plausible, even when those connections aren't actually there. And in this example, hair twisting and stress, they seem likely to be connected, right? Because hair twisting, it sounds like something that would be nervous behavior. And we know, well, nervous behaviors, yeah, they're more likely to be produced when people are feeling stressed. So, oh no, I jumped too far ahead. Apologies. So again, like I was saying, this phenomenon or this occurrence of seeing non-existent relationships is called illusory correlation. And so even though this data, it seems like, well, it's simple enough for me to understand, it's plausible, therefore I'm being influenced by those assumptions about this data, right? Of like, well, like, yeah, this data should be pretty representative, right? It was from a larger sample size, 150 students. Okay, we have kind of this nice, neat construction of dichotomous variables, right? You're either under stress or not under stress. You're either a hair twister or not a hair twister. And sort of this ease of sort of trying to intuitively process this information, in addition to the plausibility of the relationship, it influences the way that we go about thinking and making decisions. And researchers by the name of Chapman and Chapman, they actually presented a really interesting demonstration of this illusory correlation. And they actually did this within the field of clinical psychology. And so they started this research because they were really confused and also interested in this controversy that had come up over the use of something that's called a draw a person test. And so this is a psychodiagnostic test that is a test that's given to try to understand if somebody's experiencing some sort of psychopathology. So are they experiencing depression or psychosis, or is it something that we can diagnose them with from the DSM? And in this test, the person is asked to just draw a person, and the drawings are then scored according to like a number of different dimensions of the drawing. So whether the figure is drawn tall or short or muscular or overweight, or if their eyes are shaped in a certain expression, you know, are they frowning? Are they angry? Are they smiling? Is the figure, does it look childlike? Is it more like an adult? Things like that. And the issue here was that clinicians who had been using this draw a person test, they were reporting that there were strong correlations between some of the features of the drawings and then some of the certain symptoms and behaviors that were true of their clients. So, for example, there was this idea of, well, there are these, you know, sort of atypical eyes, these eyes that are just kind of weirdly drawn by clients who are more suspicious, or more intelligent clients. They tend to draw a person with bigger heads. However, these reports weren't actually confirmed by the researchers who were looking into these claims themselves. So this is just more like anecdotal evidence of like, yeah, there's this really strong connection from clinicians, and the researchers are like, no, there isn't. So in one study, Chapman and Chapman, they gave undergrad students who didn't know about the draw a person test a series of different drawings. It was something like 40, 45 drawings. And these drawings were randomly paired with symptoms that were allegedly displayed by the people who drew them. Sometimes this was the case, sometimes it wasn't. And these undergrads discovered the same correlations, the same relationships that clinicians had been reporting. And so because the drawings and the symptoms were just randomly paired, it appeared that the undergraduate students, they shared this sort of pre-existing bias as to what the relationships would be that's in the data. Essentially, they discovered relationships that they expected to find, even when there wasn't actually any evidence for that kind of relationship existing at all. And so essentially, this cognitive illusion is taking information and trying to make it match what your assumed correlation is. If you think that two things are going to be related, then you're often likely to see that sort of relationship. And so again, in this study, variables that seemed like maybe they would be related, right? Of like, well, maybe more like narrow sort of frowning faces being associated with more suspicious clients were reported, even though these associations didn't actually exist between the pictures and the clients. And so the point here is that the associations that we bring to a situation can color our judgment to such an extent that we might even see them, even though they're not actually there. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, good. Okay, so let's talk about another cognitive illusion. So consider the following decisions. So you need to choose between declaring a psych major and, let's say, an econ major. And so you think back through, okay, how you've performed in classes, your goals, the things that you've liked and disliked about classes, and you've talked with faculty, friends, parents, other people whose opinion you really trust. And you finally decide, okay, I'm going to be an econ major because I'm really interested in the topics that are taught in classes, and like just the econ professors are just like, they're really cool. And so a few months later, you start to discover that you're starting to like your econ classes less and less. And the more psych classes you take, the more interesting you're finding the field of psych to be. So you revisit this decision and you decide, actually, you know what, I think I need to switch my major to psych. And you tell friends and they're like, well, I knew this was going to happen. Like, I saw this coming. Like, obviously, like you talked about the things that you liked, like the way that you were talking about econ was just based on like professors, not like the classes themselves. Like, I saw this coming. And so this might make you think, well, how did my friends see this coming and I didn't? And it's likely that your friends might be suffering from something called hindsight bias. And so a researcher who's done a lot of research in this area, Fishoff, described this bias as a tendency to really consistently exaggerate what could have been anticipated in foresight when looking back in hindsight. So essentially this idea of the future version of yourself is saying, oh, well, yeah, of course that was true of the past version of me because you had already experienced the outcome. And so Fishoff demonstrated the hindsight bias experimentally in the following way. I thought this was great. So all the participants in this study by Fishoff, they were asked to read passages either about historical events or just like clinical cases about therapy clients. And then participants were asked to rate the likelihood of a number of outcomes from these events. So essentially they read these passages and they were kind of like cliffhangers. Like they didn't tell you exactly what the outcome was. And then they were given a series of different possible outcomes and asked, okay, well, how likely do you think that this is going to happen? How likely do you think this is going to happen? And then some of these participants were actually told which outcomes had occurred, and then they provided their estimates after the fact. So they were given sort of essentially the answer, and then they were asked, okay, well, how likely did you think it was that these different other outcomes also were going to happen? And the results of this study show that the participants who were told what the outcome actually was, they gave higher estimates of the probability of that happening in comparison to those who didn't have this information of the outcome beforehand. And so when pushed even a little bit further to just sort of, verbally describe like their thought process, participants who were given the outcomes first and then provided their estimates, they described these outcomes as, well, really as inevitable, right? Of like, well, this outcome, outcome B for this story, it was just inevitable. You could just see it coming. And this was regardless of which outcome it was. Fishoff even sort of randomized the different outcomes that certain participants were given ahead of time. And across the board, these participants were like, oh yeah, I saw outcome C coming. Like outcome D, could have seen that from a mile away. Of course that was going to happen. And so when we think back to that hypothetical with you changing your major and your friend being like, yeah, I saw that coming. The fact that they are saying that they knew it all along is probably not as likely. It's more likely that your friend was looking back in hindsight, they knew how your original decision had turned out, and they are then able to think of more reasons that are contributing to your current decision. So essentially, their ability to predict in foresight what you were going to decide was actually very much influenced by the information that they already knew, because they had seen other decisions that you had made and other outcomes. And so essentially, this is really supporting the saying that hindsight really is 20/20. Okay, so we have just a couple more cognitive illusions that we're going to go over. So let's imagine that there's a city nearby, and there are lots of different options for first grade that parents can choose from. And this means that like kindergarten parents are like really freaking out, really trying to get a sense of, well, what's going to be the best program for my student? And some of these parents, they do this by just talking to other parents. So if a prospective parent has talked to, let's say, 5 parents from a certain school who are just really happy, just like so excited, like, yes, this has been just the best sort of match for my son or daughter, then that parent is likely to become more convinced of the fact of, oh, okay, well, you know what, that school might actually be the best for my kid too. And so on the surface, this seems like a good way to go about making a decision, right? Like, what's wrong with that? Like, who better to tell a prospective parent than a parent who's currently enrolling their child in that school? The problem is that the parent who is just talking to parents at that one school is being influenced by what's called confirmation bias. And so this is the tendency to look for information that will confirm your initial hunch or hypothesis, and to overlook or ignore other information. So if we think about this parent school choice scenario, there was probably already something about that school that caused that parent to reach out and do research on it in the first place, right? They probably were feeling like, I'm kind of already leaning towards this school. Whether they were consciously aware of it or not, they were likely already leaning in that direction. And so then they began to get information that continued to confirm that direction they were headed in, right? They continued to hear, oh, well, yeah, this is absolutely a great school. And they continued to seek out more of those parents. And so people tend to go wrong here if they just continue to seek information that only confirms their initial hunch or hypothesis. So the most sort of rational decision, or the better option when trying to make a decision, when you're faced with all these different options, is to engage in random sampling. So in this example of parents, rather than just continuing to seek feedback from parents at school A, it would be helpful to talk to parents at other schools. it would also be helpful to talk to parents who used to have their kids enrolled in that school, who then transferred or maybe made the move to homeschooling or whatever the case might be. So that the parent is actually looking at all of the possible evidence and can make a more informed decision that way, rather than just continuing down this rabbit hole of confirmation bias. All right, so I am aware of the time. I don't want to jump into the next cognitive illusion just for the sake of time. So we'll go ahead and stop here, and we will continue and finish talking about cognitive illusions on Friday, and then we'll continue talking about decision making, talking about some theories and mental models.